The U.S. has released the newest national security strategy, which focuses on the idea of America First diplomacy. 2 days after the document released, the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said this in his keynote speech to the Reagan National Defense Forum.
We will instead put our nation's practical, concrete interests first. We will deter war. We will advance our interests. We will defend our people. Peace is our goal. And in service of that objective, we will always be ready to fight and win decisively if called upon. As part of this mission, this common sense approach means prioritizing 4 key lines of effort at the Department of War. First, defending the U.S. homeland and our hemisphere. Second, deterring China through strength, not confrontation. Third, increased burden sharing for U.S. allies and partners. And fourth, supercharging the U.S. defense industrial base.
On the new NSS, the New York Times has criticized the strategy, saying that you focus on profit more so than spreading democracy. Is that really the case? And does the new NSS represent a new version of the Trump doctrine or even a new form of so-called New Monroe Doctrine? There are also reports that the document release was delayed because U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had some intervention there and asking for adjustment to the China-related portion, specifically some wording and language issues. What does all this indicate? And one more thing, compared to the past NSS under the Biden administration, which used to say that the U.S. opposed any unilateral change to the status quo in Taiwan Strait, the new Trump 2.0 version only used the phrasing, does not support. Does this suggest a subtle shift in U.S. policy towards Taiwan? Hello, and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I am Wen-T Sung. To discuss these issues and so much more, I'm joined today by Guermont Lallery, Institute for National Defense and Security Research, visiting scholar, as well as for the first time, Professor Xin-Chi Chen, National Cheng Kung University Department of Political Science professor. Thank you both for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
This document has created controversy among some of America's traditional allies and friends, and has drawn positive feedback from some of America's traditional adversaries. Watch.
On ne peut pas accepter cette menace d'interférence dans la vie politique de l'Europe. Les États-Unis ne peuvent pas remplacer les citoyens européens pour choisir quels sont les bons partis et les mauvais partis. Les États-Unis ne peuvent pas remplacer l'Europe sur la vision qu'on a de la liberté d'expression.
On the other hand, a Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, had this to say.
The current administration is fundamentally different from the previous ones. And, of course, President Trump is strong now. Strong in terms of domestic political positions, and this gives him the opportunity to adjust the concept in accordance with his vision. The adjustments we are seeing, I would say, are largely consistent with our vision.
So I think I want to start, maybe just get a broad sense from both guests to start out with about this broader NSS. Obviously talk a lot about America First, and there is conversation, that question mark about whether the new NSS has a different balance between values and interests compared with past versions. I'm just wondering, maybe I'll start with you, G-Man, what's your take on this balance?
Well, I believe, and not being trite about it, I believe that President Trump and his team read the instructions on what Congress told the president to write the national security strategy. There's no requirement to put in values in the national security strategy. And I just want to briefly highlight what President Reagan signed in 1986 to emphasize the fact that it's not about values, it's about interests and protecting those interests. So each national, this is the quote from the law, each national security strategy report shall set forth the national security strategy of the United States and shall include the comprehensive description and discussion of the following: the worldwide interests, goals, and objectives of the United States that are vital, that's an important word, vital, to the national security of the United States. Second, the foreign policy, worldwide commitments, and national defense capabilities of the U.S. necessary to deter aggression and to implement the national security strategy of the United States. That's what Secretary Hegseth just said. And third, the proposed short-term and long-term uses of the political, economic, military, and other elements of national power of the United States to protect or promote the interests and achieve the goals and objectives from paragraph 1. And finally, the adequacy of the capabilities of the U.S. to carry out the national security strategy of the U.S., including an evaluation of the balance among the capabilities of all elements of national power, again important, all elements of national power of the U.S. to support the implementation of national security strategy. No reference to values.
I see. So G-Man's take is this. How about you, Professor Chen? Again, the same question about broader balance between interests and values. We know that we used to talk about not only U.S. being the indispensable power for international system, but also President Reagan talked about being a shining castle up on the hill, the beacon of democracy role. So again, what's your take on this balance?
I think that this national security strategy makes one point unmistakably clear that the United States is no longer trying to reshape the world or export democracy. So when the document talks about the so-called non-interventionism and the primacy of the United States, I think that is an essential signaling a modernized moral doctrine. And also the Trump administration is prepared to acknowledge that China and Russia dominate their own regional spheres, but is absolutely uncompromising about the United States primacy in the Western Hemisphere. So this is not old-style isolationism. I think it's a sphere of influence realism. And the United States will respond, spend resources which will make other countries more democratic, but it will defend its home hemispheres with far greater determination. And in short, I think that Trump is steering America away from the global liberal ambitions and toward a more focused hemisphere-central grand strategy.
Indeed, on that point about focus on Western Hemisphere, the new NSS does talk a lot about the notion of non-interventionism and primacy of nations. You also talk a lot, of course, about the important Western Hemisphere. Indeed, the document itself talks about perhaps coming out with a new Trumpian corollary to the traditional notion of Monroe Doctrine. Just wondering, maybe just start with you, G-Man, what's your take on this?
Right, so the document does say a predisposition to non-interventionism, but it doesn't say non-interventionism is the goal, okay? So it says, and also the idea of non-interventionism was built into the United Nations Charter, the whole idea that everyone should take care of their own country. But this document says, for a country whose interests are numerous and diverse as ours, the U.S., rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. Yet, this predisposition should set a high bar for what constitutes a justified intervention. In other words, if the U.S. intervenes, it will be at a very high level of U.S. vital interests, but it doesn't disclaim the idea that it won't intervene. And then the idea that the nation state is the primary actor in the world. That's what this national security strategy is laying out, and that the U.S. will relate to countries based on a country-to-country relationship, not on all these other concepts that have been developed over time. They're valuable. The mutual defense treaties, NATO, all these organizations are all great. But the United States is saying to all these countries, we look at you as an individual entity, and we expect a certain amount out of our relationship. And that's what Trump administration is doing.
And on that point, I think I might pivot to Professor Chen here. I know that you work on Europe a lot in your own research as well. So in our preparation for today's show, we look at some comment that's been out there already. So renowned Oxford historian Timothy Garton-Ash, for example, was relatively pessimistic on the NSS. He calls it the mother of all wake-up calls for Europe. And while some other observers find it to be more critical of Europe than of Russia and China, especially when it comes to Ukraine war. So I'm just wondering, when you read the NSS, is that your sense as well? And if so, what do you think this What kind of shift in U.S. thinking strategically does this hint?
I think first, the Trump administration wants Europe to take much own responsibilities for its own security, I think. And Washington is signal that it will no longer underwrite Europe's defense as it did in the past. I think that's very clear. And second, the National Security Report contains a strong civilizational critique of Europe and addressing immigration, demographic decline, and so-called cultural decline or even identity problems that the European countries suffer a lot from the perspective of the Trump administration. So I think all these themes can resonate with the American right and reflect deep ideological difference with the European liberal mainstreams, at least for the moment. And third, I think the heavy emphasis on the Western Hemisphere is classical Monroe Doctrine logic. So the United States intends to ensure its own backyard remain free of external forces, especially China's expanded footprint in Latin America. However, take together, I think the National Security Strategy Report is not ranking Europe, China, or Russia as equals. Instead, it's recognizing that the United States foreign policy around sphere of influence. So with the Western Hemisphere evaluated as the American strategic core, however, the Europe's ranking is downgraded as from that perspective. Thanks.
Trump posted these words on Truth Social both before and after his meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And in response to the NSS 2025, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun also has this to say.
中方始终认为，中美合则两利，斗则俱伤，相互尊重、和平共处、合作共赢，是中美正确相处之道，也是唯一正确现实选择。
So we know that Trump talked about the idea of G2 in the lead up to and just after the meeting with Xi Jinping last month. So people have been wondering whether at the time Trump was just trying to play nice or if it's showing some kind of new thinking on the US side. So in light of this, when you read the new national security strategy, do you think it confirms or denies this idea of G2 in US thinking? Maybe I'll start with you, G-Man.
Well, as we previously discussed, the United States has said the entities that are going to be talking are state-to-state actors. And so G2 follows the logic of that. And I'm not so sure I see a downgrading of U.S. relationship with Europe or with other parts of the world or even Asia. Don't forget, the National Security Strategy is two documents. One unclassified, which we've read, and the other one is the classified version. So there are parts that we don't know about, and there are references to other countries that we don't know about. So taking the fact that we don't know that other part, I can assume that the discussions inside the president's inner circle include discussions about North Korea, which is not in the currently unclassified document. So I think the idea of a G2 is good. It's good to have a discussion with your competitor, potential adversary, and try to negotiate a world where there's no conflict. But don't forget, the United States has only 330 million people. Europe, NATO, has 580 million people. So how is it that the United States has to pay for the protection of NATO when the population is almost double the United States? You see, that's the irony of it all, is that for such a long time, we just took on the responsibility. And so I think what President Trump is doing is saying, you guys need to step up. And it's no different from Trump 1.
And that message sounds like greater burden sharing and more equitable distribution of labor between U.S. and its friends and partners, perhaps. So same question, I think, for Professor Chen as well. When you read through national security strategy, do you feel a G2 worldview arising, or is it really more about playing nice again?
Okay, I think the idea of G2 is very critical, not only for Europe, for the United States, but also for Taiwan. But I think the Trump's reference to a G2 idea should be understood through pragmatic lens of national security strategy reports. I think that report makes clear that the United States has abandoned the idea of democratization China. And now treat Beijing as a strong rival that must be handled realistically. So I think that the document stress previous United States administration made mistaken assumptions about China for over 30 years and failed to reshape China's development. So I think that administration alone reflects Trump's respect for strengths and his willingness to deal with China as a great power rather than a project for political reform. But I think this document also does not endorse a true G2 condominiums, and instead it signals sphere of influence realism. As I mentioned, Washington will respect China's internal political system, yet it draws unmistakable red lines around the United States' own strategic domains, that the Western Hemisphere, Europe, even the first island chain in the Indo-Pacific.
So it sounds like there's talk about essentially not seeking regime change inside China and be willing to work with, or at least deal with the China as it is, at least for a moment. On the economy side, of course, we know that today's politics, geopolitics, and economy are often inseparable. So I'm wondering, perhaps I'll ask Professor Chen again as well. The NSS seemed to show strong vigilance towards China, especially in the commercial and trade economic front. It talked about the need to reverse more than 30 years of, quote, misguided China trade and economic policies, unquote, and calls for rebalancing of U.S.-China economic relations. What kind of signal do you think this new national security strategy sent for future economic and perhaps technological rivalry between U.S. and China?
I think the NSS sent a very clear and strong message, signals to China that economic competition with China will be the core battleground for Trump's second terms. And the strategy explicitly states that more than 3 decades of United States economic engagement with China were misguided and failed and to produce intended outcomes. So I think the call for rebuild the United States industrial strength, securing critical mineral and align United States embassies to promote United States business around the world. I think that will be a very strong signal too. I think that to mark a continuation and intentions for Trump's administration to raise the United States business or economic strength again.
G-Man, I think I'll ask you this question as well, because it's a little bit more about inside baseball, inside the U.S. side. This American media outlet, Politico, as we know, they did a report a little while ago, saying that in designing this document, the process was delayed somehow because allegedly U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent intervened in the process and asking for some adjustment to China-related language to perhaps make things easier or create more conducive atmosphere for trade negotiations. Maybe we don't have to go on about him personally so much, but I'm wondering what kind of fault line within U.S.-China policy community do you see today, and do you see that playing out in the NSS itself?
Well, actually, I see a reverse. The NSS is a culmination of all the departments under the executive coming together to compose a document that they all agree on. So along the process, there's always delays and always disagreement and reassessments and coming to compromise. So this document is the culmination of compromises between all the different departments, including the Commerce Secretary. And I would also point out that this is normal in a democracy. It's not normal in, let's say, a communist system where ultimately the doctrine of Marxism is forced down people's throats. So I would also point out that the NSS, in addition to what the professor said, also talks specifically about the importance of Taiwan and the Southeast Asian Sea, which some people call the South China Sea.
So it sounds like this rumor about different agency, different leader within the U.S. are having different opinions is only natural part of a consensus building process, which NSS is.
Correct.
That's reassuring to know. I think maybe I'll ask Professor Chen, since G-Man talked about South China Sea as well. Yes, that's one other thing that many observers have talked about as well. That is increasing talk about South China Sea is important not only not only locally, but also globally. And that you also talk about connecting to China. He talked about the need to deter China, but also to avoid direct military conflicts. Just wondering what your thought on that.
I think the NSS is very deliberately here, and it's underscored the global strategic importance of the South China Sea, because these shipping lanes are central to the United States economic growth, supply chains, and also the energy flows. But it stimulously, at the same time, stresses deterrence without direct confrontations. So this reflects Trump's, I think that Trump's ideas about the central goal of the NSS, that stabilize the United States-China political dialogue so that the economic competition remain manageable and does not spiral into military conflict or even a war.
The National Security Strategy of 2025 reiterates that the U.S. will maintain its long-standing Taiwan policy and does not support any unilateral change to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. Now, the wording does not support differs from the Biden-era language of oppose any unilateral change to Taiwan Strait. So this wording change has raised some concern from some corners about whether the U.S. is subtly adjusting, if not softening, its Taiwan policy. On this issue, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has reaffirmed that
we're not trying to strangle China's growth. We're not trying to dominate or humiliate them, nor are we trying to change the status quo over Taiwan. Our interests in the Indo-Pacific are significant, but also scoped and reasonable. This includes the ability for us, along with allies, to be postured strongly enough in the Indo-Pacific to balance China's growing power. This is what we mean by deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Not dominating China, but rather ensuring they do not have the ability to dominate us or our allies.
I think those are some words of reassurance for Taiwan right there coming from U.S. new Defense Secretary. And one thing about a new national security strategy is that it seems to place Taiwan's security in the broader regional context. We talked about before connection to South China Sea, how it's globally relevant. So in that sense, hopefully that's going to go some way towards easing concern about U.S. commitment towards Taiwan with that remark and reassurance from Pete Hegseth. Maybe I'll ask Professor Chen, how do you read into Taiwan's place in the new national security strategy?
I think the new NS document really does place Taiwan within a broader regional framework, especially with the lines that the United States will build a military capable of denying aggression anywhere along the first island chain. So I think that will be very important because it ties Taiwan security directly to the stability of the entire Indo-Pacific system, and rather than not just to so-called bilateral United States-Taiwan commitments. But we should be realistic at least, and because different audiences will report differently, as you mentioned, and the shift from the so-called Biden's administration opposed to Trump's so-called does not support unilateral actions in the Taiwan Strait sounds like a step back toward the so-called strategic ambiguity. Yet the NSS really, I think that also makes Trump's deterrence posture very clear and explicitly, because deterrence by denial agrees against any attempt by China to seize Taiwan. So I think the underlying logic is very pragmatic. And Taiwan's geography and its irreplaceable and advanced semiconductor production are a core knot in United States economic leadership and strategic primacy. So yes, I think that Taiwan gains reassurance from being embedded in the regional deterrence structure, but also it sees that the United States asserting itself as a primary manager of the cross-Taiwan Strait stabilities.
On that point about Taiwan and semiconductor, we know that news document talks a lot about the importance of commerce and trade, even talks specifically about Taiwan's role in global semiconductor manufacturing. So in light of this, G-Man, any ideas on how Taiwan can leverage tech diplomacy to better secure its place?
I just want to make one little comment before I transition to the semiconductor. Again, from the National Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific that was declassified, we get insight into the Trump administration's vision of Taiwan. Again, this was declassified. And the objective, besides deterring China, is to devise and implement a defense strategy capable but not limited to. And the second one is defending the first island chain, which we see again in this current NSS, including Taiwan. It says it in the declassified document. So Taiwan also was part of the classified framework of the previous Trump one. Now moving on to the technology question of semiconductors, I believe that Taiwan should focus on expanding its technological engagement with allies and partners. This helps Taiwan entangle itself with countries that have an interest in supporting Taiwan during a war. And Taiwan needs to disentangle itself from technologically from China and Russia and other authoritarian regimes that would not help Taiwan in a war. In other words, it's a tool that Taiwan can use because it has the most advanced semiconductors chips in the world. 90% of the high-end ones are from Taiwan.
I'd like to thank you both so much, G-Man and Professor Chen, for your wonderful insight. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.